This is our 53rd lesson on biblical hermeneutics. We're on the second lesson on this subject, prolepsis. Let's review part one, our first lesson. And prolepsis is frequently used in the scriptures. It's a very common figure of speech. Atheists, I believe, have misunderstood this figure of speech and falsely claimed that the inspired writers made factual errors as a result of their misunderstanding of this prolepsis. False religions that claim the scriptures are errant. There are those that claim the Bible has errors. There are even some that claim to be Christian that claim the Bible has errors. I don't see how one could claim to be a Christian and not believe in the inerrancy of the scriptures. But there are those that claim to be Christians that claim the Bible is errant. By errant, we mean that it has errors in it. They also misunderstand this figure of speech. Some do. Here's how this figure of speech is, prolepsis is defined by Webster, something in the nature of anticipation, in rhetoric, a figure by which a thing is represented as already done, though in reality it is to follow as a consequence of the action which is described. It's a figure by which objections are sometimes anticipated as well. So the anticipation of objections, God anticipates, I think, sometimes possible objections, and he gives an answer to them ahead of time. Places are often named before they have the name given by the Bible writer, because the writer either wrote after the fact or employed prolepsis, one of the two. And we'll see both of these are possible in some passages of Scripture. Other facts are spoken of as having taken place before they happened. And of course, this can happen in prophecy. And in the Hebrew language, there's only two tenses of verbs, and then there's a participle. There's the imperfect tense, and there's the perfect tense. And those are the two tenses of verbs, and then there's a participle, but we'll not get into that any further. But sometimes the nature of the verb, the Hebrew verb, for example, in the Old Testament, would lend itself to prolepsis. Moses saw as far north as Dan in Deuteronomy 34, 1-5, but it was not named Dan at that time whenever he saw it, but it was named Dan later. And so we see in Deuteronomy 34, 1, and Moses went up from the plains of Moab unto Mount Nebo to the top of Pisgah, that is over against Jericho. And the Lord, or Jehovah, showed him all the land of Gilead unto Dan, and all Naphtali, and the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, and all the land of Judah unto the Inner Sea. Now we ask the question, this appears by some to say that this was written after Moses died, because this land wasn't called up by that name. But we have two prophecies here. One of them in Genesis, that the land that was to be given to the 12 tribes was laid out for them by Jacob himself in prophecy. The boundaries that were given to them. They drew lots, so they cast lots for the land, and they knew what land they were going to get by lot. So the lot was laid out for them ahead of time. Now, when we see this, could very easily be that he's talking about the land that they saw at that time, that he saw was going to be Dan's inheritance, or the lot, the area that was given to Dan himself, or the tribe of Dan, and the tribe of Naphtali, and the tribe of Ephraim and Manasseh. And now we know some of these tribes, two of them were in existence, and they had taken their land on the east side of the Jordan River already. So this is another factor as well. In the south, on the plain of the Jericho, the city of palm trees, to Zoar, and Jehovah, or the Lord, said unto him, This is the land that I swear unto Abraham, and to Isaac, and to Jacob, saying, I will give it unto thy seed. I have caused thee to see it with thine eyes, but thou shalt not go over thither. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, the servant of Jehovah, died there at in the land of Moab, according to the word of Jehovah and the word of the Lord. Now, again, they claim that this is a problem, but it's not a problem if we understand prophecy and understand that this was already prophesied and toward the last chapter of Genesis and a prophecy when Jacob called his sons together and brought them in and talked to them and prophesied about what land they were going to get. He had this prophecy in the 49th chapter of Genesis, so I'd encourage you to read all that and the land that they would be given. Then you can study further about the land that they would be given by, and it was by Lot. They were given this land by Lot. And of course, the Lord saw that the lot fell exactly the way he wanted it. And his lot fulfilled the prophecy of Jacob almost on his deathbed. Any questions or comments? In Joshua 1947, the border of the children of Dan went out to beyond them, for the children of Dan went up and fought against Leshan and took it and smote it with the edge of the sword and possessed it and dwelt there and called Leshan Dan after the name of Dan their father. Some think that the Dan that he saw, it was the city. I think it was the area that Dan was going to inherit that he saw, but that we can't be certain about this. But it seems to me when you let's go back and look at them, you see what I'm talking about here. And here he says on the land of Gilead, back to verse 1, Dan, Naphtali, and Ephraim, and Manasseh. He's naming the tribe. In the land of Judah, he's naming tribes, not cities. So he's naming the tribes, not the cities. In that, it would be strange if he named one city and the rest of them were tribes. So I think it's definitely referring to the area that they were to inherit, and that they had already been, lots had already been cast to tell them where they're going to have their land. Any comments there? Now, he named the city. The place that is being considered is the land that was given to the tribe of Dan, not the city called Dan. Again, as I pointed out, you can see he's talking about the tribes and all the other ones that are considered tribes in the area that they were to inherit. This is merely the land of Dan, not the city, but this is Prolepsis. It was called Dan before the tribe of Dan possessed it, because they were in 49th chapter of Genesis, the prophecy had been made, and then the lots had already been cast for them. Land of Canaan was divided by lot in Joshua 19, verses 40 and following, and God determined how the lot fell. Therefore, God knew what land the tribe of Dan would receive. He was going to see that it occurred, according to the prophecy. Jacob prophesied the division of the land of Canaan in Genesis 49, as I've already pointed out. Knew which land the tribe of Dan would receive before they received it. And of course, he had Moses to write about it. Then they received it after Moses' death, and Moses still recorded this as a prophet. The land that he saw was the land that God said that Dan would obtain. He named Ephraim, Manasseh, and I believe Naphtali and Judah, and Dan, those tribes, what he could see, their land. Now, let's look at another one here. Things spoken of as having taken place before occurring. Eve is given the name of Eve because she was the mother of all living. And the man called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. Well, at the time he named her, she was not the mother of all living, that is, of all living people, because she wasn't her own mother, obviously. That'd be ridiculous. And she wasn't the mother of Adam. So she was the mother of all people who would come out of Adam and Eve. And that is all humans that have ever lived. She is their mother, except herself and Adam. That's quite evident. That's axiomatic. That's self-evident truth. She wasn't their mother, wasn't her own mother, and wasn't the mother of Adam. But Adam is naming her and give her this name because all humans are going to come out of her. Any questions? I think Adam is doing this as a prophet, speaking this as a prophet. And he spoke because God told him and revealed it to him. She was neither her own mother nor the mother of Adam, but she was the mother of the race. When Moses wrote, she was the mother of all of race. So it could have been that this name Eve was given because she was the mother of all living, and that Adam gave his wife that name, and he gave it to her as a prophet, and that all of a race would be born of her. And it might be that Moses recorded this, that name meant Eve, and that the words that I'll put my mouse over, the words because she was the mother of all living, might have been written by Moses after the fact. Because when Moses wrote it, she was the mother of everybody living at that time. And I think, however, it's almost certainly a prophecy on the part of Adam, where he prophesied, and that she's going to be the mother of the race of all humans that ever lived, except herself and Adam, of course. Okay? Questions or comments? But there are two parts. Right? And I think the most reasonable one is that Adam is prophesying. The second possible explanation is the last part of the verse, the words, because she was the mother of all living, was recorded by Moses, and it was true when he recorded it, when he wrote the book of Genesis. But I think that's the second possibility, but it's probably, in my judgment, the least likely to be the case. It would pose a contradiction to have her to be her own mother and or the mother of Adam. Therefore, this is a figure of speech called prolepsis, or it's an inspired commentary of Moses explaining why the name Eve was given. And when Moses wrote the book of Genesis, Eve was the mother of all that were living in the lifetime of Moses. But I think it's most likely a prophecy on the part of Adam. And that God gave that name through Adam, and that's what that name, why the name was given, because she's the mother of all living. Judas is said to be the one who betrayed Jesus in Matthew 10:4, yet he did not do this until about a year later. Enlisting in the limited commission, Simon the Canaanite, or Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. Now, when Matthew wrote the book of Matthew, this, of course, was the truth, that Judas Iscariot had betrayed the Lord whenever Matthew wrote. And I think this is probably just comments, the listing of these men, and the comments by inspiration of Matthew, the Apostle Matthew, was that Judas Iscariot had betrayed the Lord. I think this is just inspired commentary explaining who this Judas was. Why does he name him Judas Iscariot? Because there was two men named Judas, and they had different names. My name is Marion Ronald Fox, and I've been called Ron by some people that didn't like the name Marion, and I've been called Marion by most people, and Mariana. And so that's what happens. Sometimes I've known people who have had different names, and the name Ronald could be Ron or Ronnie, and you could have a variant of them. Judas Iscariot, I think his father's name was Iscariot. I think that's what it was. This passage, many like it, are claimed to be factual errors by atheists. Well, when Matthew was written, it was true. And Matthew, by inspiration, recorded it. So there's no conflict and no problem here. No reason to claim there's an error in the scriptures at all. This may not even be prolepsis here. It's probably just a recording after the fact. Either the atheists are ignorant of this figure of speech, or they are dishonest and not considering the possibility of these passages being prolepsis. And this passage in Judas and Prolepsis is probably not Prolepsis, it's just an Apostle Matthew writing history. Because when Matthew wrote the book of Matthew, Judas had betrayed the Lord. I live in the state of Oklahoma, and the state of Oklahoma was part of the Louisiana Purchase. I think that was in about 1803 that we purchased the Louisiana Purchase from France at that time. And so I think this was about 1803 that this occurred. Most of the state of Oklahoma was part of the Louisiana Purchase. Now, with that in mind, we asked this question. I could write about my state and say in 1500, Oklahoma was explored by the Spaniard Coronado. Or I could name some French explorers that came even before that time or earlier, even before Coronado, or about the time of Coronado. And I could say Oklahoma was explored, but it wasn't called Oklahoma at that time. It was something that had another name. It was just territory that was ruled by one of the countries or another, and they were just ruled by Indian tribes at that time. The various tribes had controlled different portions of the state. But it wasn't the state of Oklahoma. It wasn't called Oklahoma back then, but it's still the same land. And so we need to be very careful. Sometimes I could say Oklahoma was part of the Louisiana Purchase. Well, it wasn't called Oklahoma when it was purchased in the Louisiana Purchase. So, but no one would accuse me of being in error to say this, but yet they'll manufacture errors out of the Bible when they're trying to prove that God doesn't exist or that the Bible has some kind of an error in it. The words of John 3:13 are possibly another example of prolepsis, but and no one hath ascended into heaven, but he that descended out of heaven, even the Son of Man who is in heaven. This right here is not, if it's the words of Jesus, it's prolepsis. No one hath descended into heaven, but he that descended out of heaven, even the Son of Man. Now, Jesus could have said those words, who is in heaven. Now, he wouldn't have said those words except as prolepsis. I don't think verse 13, if you got a red letter edition Bible, I don't think verse 13 is part of the words of Jesus. Unfortunately, this is printed in red print in a lot of red letter edition Bibles. But that's just the opinion of the men who printed that Bible. I think this is probably just the words and not the word, not actually even prolepsis. It's probably just the words of the inspired Apostle John as he wrote. And he said, no one has descended into heaven, but he descended out. The only one who's descended into heaven is Jesus, who descended out of heaven. And he's in heaven at the time of John writing the book of John. So verse 12 should be in red letters. Verse 13 should not. It's not the words of Jesus. I'm convinced it's not even prolepsis. But even if you attribute these words to Jesus, it can still be prolepsis in prophetic form. But I think that's the least likely explanation for it. Most likely, these are the words of the Apostle John. He's making an inspired commentary on the events at that time. Jesus was not in heaven when he spoke to Nicodemus, but was in heaven when John wrote the book of John. So I think verse 12, Jesus uttered while upon the earth. Verse 13, John wrote it as inspired commentary to explain it. And he went back to the words of Jesus. Any questions or comments? The verse should not be in red letters in the red letter edition, so I don't think it's prolepsis. But even if you attribute it to Jesus, you can still argue it's prolepsis because Jesus could be prophesying of something that would occur in the future. And it would be happening whenever the book was read, when the book of John was read, when this was written. Paul reveals that God used prolepsis in Romans 4:17. As it is written, the Father of many nations have I made thee. See, this is written, I made of thee a father of many nations. I have made thee. When he said, I have made thee, have I made thee, this quote from the Old Testament certainly wasn't the truth at the time it was given to God, or God said that to Abraham. Before him whom we believe, even God, who giveth life to the dead, calleth things that are not as though they were. So here, the Father of many nations have I made thee. This wasn't true when God spoke it to Abraham, but it would be true because it's a prophecy of what's going to happen, and it did happen after the lifetime of Abraham, even after he died. And so this occurred. He became the father of all of the descendants of Ishmael and Isaac, which would be Jacob or the children of Israel, and Esau, the Edomites. He became the father of all of the descendants of Keturah, the woman that he married after Sarah died, and he had about 5 or 6 sons by them, and they had nations coming out of them. And then all these people that are married with one another. So we had 2 nations coming out of Jacob. That would be Judah, the southern 2 tribes, and then Israel, the northern 10 tribes. At first it was 1 nation, then they split after the death of Solomon. So we had 2 nations there. And then we had the Edomites, descendants of Isaac through Esau, and then the Ishmaelites. And then we had the sons of Keturah, and all of them had nations. Okay. But this happened after the death of Abraham. And so this would be prolepsis for sure. Right? And God spoke it because it's a form of prophecy. And it's not a problem. I have no problem with it. I don't see any way that there's a rational reason, a logical reason to claim there's a contradiction. But Herod the Tetrarch is another one, being reproved by him for Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, for all evils which Herod had done, added yet this above that he shut up John in prison. So he shut up John in prison. This is recorded after these events occurred. So he did all of this, and it's written in Luke 3. Now at this time, whenever we look into the time frame of Luke 3, this occurred later in the time frame. Shut him up. Again, this is probably prolepsis in prophetic form, but it might easily be just Luke wrote this after the cross. He wrote these events and recorded this historical fact, just like I could talk about my state, Oklahoma, being part of the Louisiana Purchase. And the house where I live in right now was part of the Louisiana Purchase. The land was part of the Louisiana Purchase, purchased from France by the United States. Any comments? It's not recorded in chronological order, and it doesn't have to be historical events. Because I could record that the land was purchased in the Louisiana Purchase, and then I could go back in time and say this land was explored as part of where I grew up was explored by Coronado, the Spanish explorer Coronado, as he went through in the 1500s. And in about 1803, I think it was 1803, the Louisiana Purchase this land was acquired from France. It was controlled by France and Spain back and forth, and finally the United States purchased it. In Hebrews 2:7, thou madest him a little lower than the angels, and crownest him with glory and honor, and didst set him over the works of thy hands. But now all of this didn't occur whenever this is a quote of Old Testament scripture. It's prophecy. And he states it as if it had already occurred, but it's in prophetic form. And this is Messiah being made Lord of the angels, and his crown is glory and honor, and he set him over the works of thy hands. That had put all things in subjection under his feet. Now this didn't occur until he ascended. See? For in that he subjected all things to him, he left nothing that is not subject to him. But now we see not yet all things being subjected to him. So this will finally occur at the second coming part of this. So this is a series of prophecies that were uttered hundreds of years before they occurred. But we behold him who has been made a Lord of the angels, even Jesus, because of the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor. So he's summarizing what this is all about. And by the grace of God, he should taste of death for every man. So verse 9 summarizes verses 7 and 8, tells you what it's all about. Much time looking into it. I hope to go through the book of Hebrews sometime in the near future. Maybe we can translate it in the translation class. Now, to summarize this, places are often named before they had the name given by the Bible writer because the writer either wrote after the fact or employed prolipsis. And some instances it could be prolipsis, some instances it could be that he wrote it historically after the fact. Let me illustrate another illustration, if I might. In the country of Russia, the city of St. Petersburg was, I think it was named after Peter the Great, not the Apostle Peter, but I'm not sure of that. I have to go back and check that. But it was later then changed the name from St. Petersburg to Leningrad, and then it was changed back to St. Petersburg later. So it's had the name St. Petersburg and Leningrad and back to St. Petersburg. So the name has been changed more than once. So the names of various places have been changed. And again, the state where I live, the area where I live now was part of Indian territory, and it was supposed to have come in as the state of Sequoia. And the President Theodore Roosevelt didn't want 4 Democrat senators. So it was going to come in as 2 states. Oklahoma was, state of Oklahoma and the state of Sequoia. But roughly the eastern half of the state would have been the state of Sequoia, and the western half would have been the state of Oklahoma. Now, but where I live would have been the state of Sequoia. It was part of the Indian territory, and then it became part of the state of Oklahoma. It's an interesting history, nonetheless, but this is the kind of thing that we have. And I could talk about it. Where I live was at one time Indian territory, and it was part of the Louisiana Purchase. So my land that I live on, the plot of land my house is on, was part of the Louisiana Purchase. Now let's move on. Other facts were spoken of as having taken place before they happened. This would be prolipsis. Are there any questions?
Not here, anyway.